All right, let's get going. So today I'm going to present to you some ambitious work that I've been doing with my colleague, Dr. Alex Kelly at Carleton University. I'm Alex Ororbia, and I am the director of the Neural Adaptive Computing Laboratory at Rochester Institute of Technology. So again, all of us here at CogSci know what artificial neural nets roughly are, so I'm not going to bore you with all the repetitive details of connectionist modeling. However, we know that artificial neural nets, particularly deep ones, are good at processing large quantities of data. They can handle continuous valued data as well, but they're not typically used to model high-level cognition. They're typically used to actually train and model expertise on a single narrow task. And notably, although we're not going to particularly address this part in this work, although it is a large-scale motivation for everything we do, is combating catastrophic interference. What does that mean? You train a neural net on one task, train it on another, it forgets everything in the previous task. And so we're going to, that was one of our motivations for this work in the earlier days. So we also have, on the other hand, symbolic architectures like ACTAR, SOAR, Sigma, a whole variety, actually hundreds of these architectures, many of them more well-known than others. And these things are able to capture high-level cognition, can perform multiple distinct tasks, but they don't necessarily scale quite well to big data, and they have trouble handling naturalistic continuous value data, although I'm sure you can point out examples where hacks or modifications were done to allow them to do so. So what is our architecture? We're proposing CogNGen, or the Cognitive Neural Generative System. And essentially, this work is focusing on the kernel, or the core, to borrow a term from operating systems. And the way the system is imagined is that we can extend this with other modules as we go. We will see that there are parts missing, and we hope to extend them in future work. So our theoretical grounding is actually the standard model of mind, or the common model of cognition, which was proposed by Laird et al. And also confirmed neuroscientifically by Stocko et al. On actual fMRI data, that this actually captures a wide variety of commonalities across different cognitive architectures and kind of gives us an actual foundational blueprint of what we would want to implement in any particular cognitive architecture. So that's one of our kind of starting points. And of course, our cognitive architecture bridges artificial neural nets and symbolic models, combining the advantages of each, but with a particular twist, as we will see soon enough. Again, just to review, I already mentioned that this is our blueprint architecture. Of course, in the common model of cognition, we have, of course, a couple of arrows that relate some aspects of transfer across modules and how information is passed or modified by different ones. So of course, if we have a solid arrow, that's just data that will be passed between modules or components. And if we have dashed arrows, this is a modulation. So for example, if we had a basal ganglia model, which we don't in this particular architecture, we have some procedural memory, this would actually modulate any information that would be transferred from the working memory to perhaps semantic memory or episodic memory, you name it. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, CogNGen instantiates most of these modules, and it's pretty extensible to incorporate anything that we might be missing. So we have two building blocks. One of them is actually a symbolic memory system. We actually want to work eventually with holographic representations, but we're working with a classic memory model called Minerva II, proposed by Hintzman in 1986, actually. And it's a computational model of human secondary memory, although we will use it as a form of long-term memory and even sometimes as a middleman memory. And it accounts for actually many different phenomena: recognition, category, implicit learning, and you can see the rest here on the slide, distributional learning. And again, for very, very specific technical questions about our Minerva II modules in our system, I'll also defer and refer you to my colleague, Dr. Kelly, as I'm not a particular expert on that. I'm an expert on the other component, but I can chat about how they were integrated. The nice thing about Minerva II, though, is it provably approximates a Hebbian auto-associative network with actually many neurons. And it actually turns out to be easier to simulate this with a growing table of vectors. And then there's a couple other mechanisms that emulate the retrieval through cues and probes. And again, a nice connection to transformers is that you can think of the attention layer, and the mathematics on how this retrieval is conducted actually emulates that to some degree. So again, Minerva II essentially will take pattern vectors, continuous valued or discrete valued, and we will store these in our table. So again, the idea is that we'll put a new memory vector when we encounter it into this new row in this matrix. As you can see here illustrated briefly. And then of course, if we want to retrieve something from this large scale memory, we actually need a queue. So we'll have a particular pattern vector that might, for example, induce the system to do heteroassociative pattern completion. It can do autoassociative. In this work, we use it to do actual heteroassociative, so to predict something else that relates or correlates to a particular pattern. And what is retrieved is called an echo, which is essentially just a sum of all the memories weighted by their cube. And the cube and the power function, you don't have to use particularly a cube, just emphasizes the contribution of the most similar memories to the presentation of probe. And this affects, for example, if you're using a cosine similarity metric, how things are retrieved. And I have the equation there, but I'm going to skip for sake of time. We can talk about dynamics later. The other component is the neural generative coding circuit, which is essentially an instantiation through a lot of other prior work of predictive processing or predictive coding, as some people might be particularly familiar with that brain theory. And so essentially NGC is a family of artificial neural networks based on predictive processing, and the foundational concept that drives them is predict then correct learning. And again, as we saw earlier, the Minerva II is used for the declarative and the working memory modules when needed, and also then we'll use the neural generative coding circuits to approximate things like the procedural memory, the motor cortex, and perceptual modules if we indeed do so. So what are the neurobiological motivations of predictive coding? Because as you know, we're not going to actually use backpropagation of errors, which is the common way of training artificial neural networks. This is a completely backprop-free system. So we want to keep everything grounded in actual potential learning mechanisms that happen in the brain. So essentially NGC or predictive coding says the brain is constantly generating hypotheses. You're constantly guessing the state of your environment, and then you get data, perhaps beams of light, that actually will use the sensory stimuli to correct that representation. And then, of course, I'm highlighting some of my precursor theory. The idea, though, is that you can think of the NGC circuits and actually even CogNGen roughly in a gross level as minimizing variational free energy, which, again, you might have been familiar with the free energy principle. And of course, the idea is that we're going to build neural circuits that actually pass bottom-up and top-down messages and essentially try to converge to stable latent activities that please certain mappings, or as I've done in other work, can serve as latent variable generative models and all other kinds of cool things, including temporal ones. The other aspect to NGC is sparsity. We know that actually through fMRI studies and just general knowledge about the brain, all your neurons don't fire at once. We actually want to encode sensory information with very, very few active neurons. And of course, I cite some inspirational work from Howells in 1996 for the famous one-layer linear generative sparse coding model. But of course, in work that we did and prior supporting work was using lateral connectivity, and actually lateral connectivity and synapses fit quite nicely in the NGC framework, as opposed to things like in backprop where you would need to then unroll the network through time. And I could go on forever about how even that's even more biologically implausible, as we don't technically unroll our brains. The nice thing is there's practical benefits to doing this as well. Circumvents a lot of problems with backprop, weight transport, the global feedback problem. You can even do things without derivatives. Last point I want to mention about this concrete circuit implementation that has been developed and tested on a lot of different problems is that it actually can be formulated as a spiking neural model, particularly known as spiking neural coding. So we can actually build a connection to this down to actually spike trains and start working at different levels of granularity, which highlights something else about CogNGen when the combination of these modules is that it sort of lies in a spectrum of cognitive architectures. We have Actar on one end that's symbolic, high level, does amazing things, but it kind of has its own limitations. And then we have Spawn kind of on the other end, which is very, very low level, works at things at spike trains, and is useful for other purposes. And we have CogNGen that lies somewhat as a middleman and a bridge between these types of architectures, which might be inspirational for related work. So I won't try to dwell too long on the dynamics of a generative coding circuit, but we can sum it up with three rough equations. At the top, I just have two diagrams that contrast your typical backpropagation network, even actually formulated such that it doesn't have a particular input, but it could. So no input, just predicting acts like a generative model. And essentially we have error that's calculated at the output layer, and then we do indirect adjustment of all the synapses by percolating the signal back. NGC does this in a local way and allowing us to do Hebbian rules to actually adjust the weights. So it actually already circumvents another problem with backprop. So the easiest way to think about the neural state dynamics, which of course there are sort of two neurons that serve, types of neurons that serve as inspiration. For the state or predictive neurons, you could think of them as deep pyramidal cells, and the error neurons as superficial pyramidal cells. You can break down the equation roughly into four forms. That way we can just get onto the cognitive architecture components. You have a leak, you have a bottom-up message, you have a top-down message, which again allow this thing to converge when you pass through multiple iterations. You have a function that can be designed to create the lateral synaptic connectivity. And then we have a dampening function, which in prior work can be omitted even. So it means you can do things derivative free and the system learns just fine. Or you can apply approximations, for example, if you want to induce homeostatic constraints. And of course, the bottom two equations just highlight that one particular layer of neurons is going to make a prediction or an expectation. And then we have error neurons that will compute a mismatch signal. And again, those are like the superficial pyramidal neurons those messages will then be passed along through synaptic error weights or recurrent weights, however you design the system. So just at a quick visual high level, you can imagine, let's say, a 3-layer system with X being plugged in and some target value that you want the system to predict, but we don't know the hidden layer activities. These are stateful, of course, as we saw in our dynamics equation. We have each layer make a prediction, so we just have 2 predictions in this. Then we have the error neurons calculate the mismatch signal between the predictions of one layer and the actual target activity of another layer of neurons, or if you're at the very bottom, the actual sensory stimuli. And then we just pass these back along through recurrent synapses that will then be used to adjust according to the state dynamics equation. And let's move on. So if we want to put these circuits together, we have a bunch of different modules, and I will try to go through this as fast as I can. So perception turns out to be rather simple. In the problem space that we look at, we actually use a fixed encoder and decoder for this study to speed up our simulations. However, that is not to say that it couldn't be learned with NGC circuits. So that's something that will work in future work. And also, according to the common model of cognition, we can model different modalities with different NGC circuits. The procedural memory components, and as you can see in the common model of cognition, I try to highlight where we are working on and then what in that other general implementation architecture this affects. The neural generative procedure memory is just used to estimate the expected reward. It's kind of playing the role of the basal ganglia, but it's also serving as a dynamics model to compute what is known as an epistemic reward. All you need to know about that is that this is a reward that encourages parsimonious, intelligent exploration of an environment, because we know in reinforcement learning, we're balancing exploration with goal-directed behavior. And of course, the reward at the very bottom shows that we're going to take that epistemic signal that's generated by a procedural memory model and combine it with an instrumental or goal-orienting signal, which would be produced by another NGC circuit called the prior preference. I'm borrowing lingo from active inference, which is another process theory that some of you might be familiar with. You can also just use the reward of the problem, which is what we did in this study. So again, the dynamics model is rather simple. It just takes in an action, takes in the current state vector, the environment, makes a prediction, compares it to the next state of the environment. And then, of course, we can calculate the epistemic signal by summing up all the signals of the error neurons, pass them through a Minerva filter memory, which is just a short-term memory that tries to remember, have I seen this current state of the environment or not? And then it filters that signal to produce either a negative penalty. For example, if this the agent is exploring something that it's seen and kind of stuck in a loop, or if it's seeing something novel and it encourages to go explore that, which will help it clear episodes much sooner. We are going to work in reinforcement learning if I didn't make that clear. The motor action model works together with the dynamics model and essentially has 2 sets of actions. One set of actions are set to affect the actual environment. So that's the AEXT, and then AINT is just the internal actions that manipulate another working memory module that I'll describe right now. Again, just a dynamics model interacts with the motor action model. This self-recurrent memory buffer actually just stores particular pattern vectors. And then this is another thing that can complement the Minerva II memory. I'm not going to dwell on this as well. It's kind of like a simple recurrent neural network that the motor action model can modify over time. And then the last piece that I'm also not going to dwell on, there's actually a lot of details for those that are interested, please see me offline. We approximate the episodic memory buffer that's typically used in reinforcement learning actually with Minerva II. It's a fascinating process on how to encode memory and sample from it, but I want to get to the results. So I'm just going to skip to that. So of course we did GIM mini grid, which is just essentially a set of maze learning tasks. We did 2 tasks in this work, door key, where we have an agent that's spawned randomly in an environment, has to find a particular key of a certain color or one color and open a door and then explore the next room and exit. And then another one called the memory task, where the agent is presented with an input stimuli like a ball or a key, excuse me, and it has to escape the environment by matching the particular exit. So for example, if it sees a ball, it should go up and match that ball. We also, again, as I mentioned, used fixed encoders. The environment had 6 discrete actions, sparse rewards, and we compare them to a couple very important deep learning baselines like BBold and random network distillation. Long story short, turns out that CogNGen actually is competitive with state-of-the-art reinforcement learning intrinsic curiosity models. Again, the key is to look at for the green curve. So on the left-hand side is the expected cumulative return. So higher is better. And if it flatlines, it means it's solved the task and stably resides there. On the other side, it's episodic length. We want shorter episodes. We'd love the agent to solve tasks faster. So again, as we can see, CogNGen sometimes is a little bit slower in trying to get to the smaller episode sizes compared to some baselines. But again, we have to give some credit. It's working with approximate memory, which induces a lot of error. And then in the paper, we discuss other potential reasons why it's not exactly the same as some of these state-of-the-art. Just to summarize some of the results, we can see that actually in terms of accuracy, CogNGen solves completely, just like state-of-the-art baselines, the door key task, and actually is the best in terms of the memory task. As for example, RND and BBold do not have memory systems coupled to them, so they're not going to be able to hold in any kind of working memory what stimuli they saw to exit. And of course, we have some results on episodic length, and the paper discusses these at length. What are the conclusions? Well, CogNGen can learn grid rule tasks. Performance is on par with powerful deep learning methods, and we've done so without backpropagation of errors or any differentiable system at all, combining Minerva II classical memory model with predictive processing circuits. And then the other nice thing is it can also outperform baselines on certain tasks. So this highlights a very nice synergy that can motivate future cognitive architecture development. And of course, future work is to extend this now to multiple tasks in a sequence continual RL that will force us to build a basal ganglia model, which we have some preliminary work to highlight this, doing other things like using holographic memory to scale up a little bit better Minerva II, and also integrating a semantic memory. We don't have semantic memory in the system, it's just episodic memory. So our declarative memory is a little bit incomplete, but as we said, it's easily extendable. And I just have some bonus results while we take questions. It also turns out that CogNGen can work on procedurally generated environments. We have tested it on more things since this paper. So thank you, and I'm ready to take any questions with whatever time is left.